The first time Harkort spread across the forward screens, I had one hand inside a burn board, and grease ground into the cracks of my knuckles from a valve pack I should never have touched without supervision. Harkort was the survey name for the world ahead, a blue-green planet with open water, cloud bands, and gravity close enough to ours that children in the middle decks had already begun drawing houses on it in their copybooks. We were supposed to be on the last clean leg of deceleration, the sort of burn every propulsion officer trains for from boyhood and most never gets to fly. And the whole Ark had turned festive around us. Propulsion did not get festivals. By old shift custom, we kept working while the rest of the ship dressed for arrival. The viewing galleries in the civic spine opened one by one, long public bays where families gathered to watch the target world on wall-sized screens tied into the ship's forward optics. People dressed for it the way old people dressed for burial, because over generations the rites had braided together. Mothers stitched silver thread into sleeves. Fathers took children up early to get places by the glass. Memorial bells rang through the passenger decks at slow, formal intervals. Every ring had its own customs. Every ring understood what the bells meant. I kept my eyes on the board. That had always been my way. The ship was bearable when it could be reduced to lines, loads, tolerances, and causes. Pipes leaked because a seal failed. Chambers ran hot because a ratio drifted. Men and women did whatever else they did up in Civic, but a drive board either balanced or it didn't. When I was 14, Nate Doran told me I trusted panels more than people because panels didn't lie unless someone had taught them to. I had laughed then. I thought he was joking. The drive room lay under my boots like a live thing under restraint. Nothing romantic, just 6 stacked chambers of heat, pressure and controlled violence running aft through the hull. The Ark had crossed a distance nobody aboard could picture whole, and the drive had done it by shaving speed for generations. I was one of the men trusted to tell that force where to go. Stark. Chief Leon Galt leaned around the rack behind me, his shoulders filling the aisle. Galt had been in propulsion longer than I had been alive. A coolant line had burst under his eye during training when he was young, and he treated every part of the ship the way practical men treat weather. Worth respect, never worth sentiment. "You going to stare at that panel until we land on it by shame?" "There's a side feed running through gallery control," I said. "It crosses Civic display, drops into med telemetry, and comes back tagged as calibration support." Galt glanced at the screen. The route sat there in thin blue lines under 3 layers of routine overlays. "Arrival support," he said. "It's never linked this deep." "It links deep when command wants the whole show. People faint, children seize. Old men decide the sky is personally insulting. Med watches the galleries. Civic adjusts display load, and everyone pretends civilization is still in charge." He started to turn away. I caught his sleeve. "There's a trim packet tied to it." That made him look at me again. The packet sat 2 levels lower in the board, tucked inside a run of harmless correction notes and labelled damping assist. The numbers under it would nudge our deceleration profile by a margin small enough to survive inspection and large enough to matter if the approach got interrupted. Galt keyed source authority. The tag came back with the seal of central stewardship. "Command override," he said. "Why does command get a vote on trim?" "Because every landing attempt becomes political the moment people see dirt on the screen." He peeled my hand off his sleeve with irritation. "Keep the burn inside band. Let Civic stage its solemnities. We get paid to bring the nose down, Stark, not to educate stewards on crowd management." He moved off before I could answer. Across the rack, Caleb Hurst saw my face and gave me a crooked grin. Caleb was 3 years older than I was, married into hydroponics, already losing his hair, steady in the way some married men aboard the Ark became. He had a daughter named June, who liked to ride his shoulders during memorial processions, and had once informed me, with great seriousness, that engines were just furnaces with ambition. "You found another sacred mystery?" he asked. "I found a stupid one." "Good. Sacred ones get you killed slower." He went back to his board. Over the deck speakers, the voice of Adrian Kessler, first steward of the Ark, rolled out in polished civic calm. "Citizens," he said, "we enter the final survey arc of Harkort. Families may proceed to assigned galleries. Medical attendants stand ready. Approach remains under sacred caution. Honor signs of strain. Report distress early. A safe landing begins with disciplined minds." Arrival sickness always came in the same breath as wonder. It was the first doctrine every child learned after deck numbers and emergency seals. Human beings raised inside a closed world, we were taught, could break when confronted with planetary scale too quickly or without proper civic preparation. Open sky and depth could produce panic, violence, dissociation, religious mania, family annihilation. People could become convinced their dead were calling to them from fields or water. The doctrine shaped schooling, medicine, ritual, and law. It explained why viable worlds had been passed before. It explained why approach belonged as much to civic authority as to engineering. I had believed it all my life. Most of me still did then. My problem lay with the trim packet. The burn settled into its long, hard rhythm. Vibration came through the deck in measured shivers, and the chamber walls gave back a low metal complaint that lived in bone more than ear. I checked the fuel mix, watched angle hold, watched the hidden line stay where it had no business being. Then a new route flashed across the feed. Gallery 3. Manual access. That gallery sat above our section in the civic spine, one of the smaller officer galleries often used by duty families and technical staff. Nate had taken his younger sister Ellen up there because Ward 9 had finally allowed her supervised movement. Ellen had been caught in a cargo lift crush 3 months earlier. Bone mesh had rebuilt her pelvis. She had spent the whole recovery making everyone around her miserable, in the energetic way only a truly improving patient can. I had seen them on my way down to shift. Nate had one arm around her, while she leaned on a rail cane and complained that everyone aboard the Ark walked like they expected the decks to apologize for existing. "If Harkort's ugly," she had told me, "I want my injury back." "You never had your injuries since," Nate had said. She'd smiled at me then, pale, but game. "If they've got oceans, Daniel, tell the engines not to scare them off before I see one." That memory came back with absurd force when the manual access tag lit. I keyed the route open. It split through med monitors, then into a buried visual module I had never seen before. "Caleb," I said, "watch my board." His expression changed at once. "For how long?" "2 minutes," Galt barked from the far rack. "Stark." "Gallery fault," I called. "I'm checking it." He swore at me and told me to come back alive enough to finish my shift. That was permission enough. I ran. The service corridor turned sharp twice on the way up, one shoulder scraping pipe rail on the second bend. The civic spine sat above propulsion like a polished lie above a furnace. I came out of a maintenance hatch behind Gallery 3's back wall, where display cables and med patch lines fed into a cabinet the size of a coffin. The access panel already stood open. Someone had beaten me there. The module inside was new metal bolted into old housing. No manufacturer's mark. 3 service lights stepped in sequence. One line carried the live feed from forward optics. One linked to crowd monitors in the seats and wristbands issued at gallery entry. The third ran into a routing tree no public display had any right to touch. Approval feedback. The phrase caught in my head because I'd seen it before only in dead indexes from civic archive classes, ancient group response systems from the early voyage, when the Ark still pretended consensus and broad ratification governed major change. The old nets measured posture, stress, speech clustering, interruption rates, pulse shifts, and turned disagreement into numbers leadership could call public will. Most of those systems had supposedly been retired generations earlier. I put my hand over the emergency cutout. The gallery lights changed. A woman near the front gave a sharp cry. Someone else laughed once, high and wrong. Through the service grill I saw Harkort bloom across the wall screen with such clarity that the room leaned toward it as one body. Ocean glare, Cloud towers, a dark line of mountains near the Terminator, real land after generations of steel, ducting and ceilings. Then the image opened into depth. That is the nearest language I have. The wall stopped reading as surface and began to read as distance. People nearest the screen threw out their hands as if the floor had tipped beneath them. A boy in a red scarf shouted that he could hear waves. An old man whispered, almost reverently, "My mother's there." The cutout under my hand stayed cold. Someone had locked it. A woman slammed her palm against the glass and cried for her son. The boy she meant stood beside her. He reached for her wrist and she clawed his face because whatever she saw on the shore had convinced her the child beside her was not the child she had born. Seats crashed back. A man in the third row dropped flat and covered his head, yelling that the sky was folding inward. A little girl ran full tilt into the barrier and bounced off hard enough to leave blood on the lower panel. "Nate!" He could not hear me through the glass, and the room had already risen into noise beyond hearing. The module lights raced faster, feeding on the bodies in the seats. I understood it in one sick instant. The system watched fear rise and learned from it, pressing harder where the room was weakest. The crowd's distress was the mechanism. I yanked at the side harness. Current snapped through my wrist and up my arm hard enough to numb my hand. The cabinet spat sparks. Inside the gallery, the screen broke into overlapping frames, recovered, then warped further. Harkort remained there, but now people stood on its beaches who did not belong there at all. Faces from memorial walls, family shrines, school remembrance screens, dead men and women the viewers knew. A woman laughed until blood ran from her nose. A man took hold of the seat rail and beat his forehead against it to drive away whatever was calling him from the shoreline. Someone behind the front row began praying in a voice stripped of words. I hit the cabinet with my shoulder and tore the power trunk loose. The screen went black. The screaming kept going. With the image gone, the room did not settle. People were stranded inside whatever had just been forced into them. Some fought empty air. Some folded into the seats and bit their own hands. One child sobbed for a grandmother who had died before he was born. A service guard tried to force the front doors and got mobbed by people desperate to escape. I found Nate through the gaps in bodies. He had Ellen tucked behind him against the side rail, one arm around her shoulders, the other shoving people off when they crashed toward them. Her hospital brace showed white under her coat. Her face had gone colorless with pain. I hit the side release for the emergency shutters. Metal screens slammed down over the dead display. The hard rattle triggered another surge of panic, but it turned the open abyss back into a room with walls. "Nate, left door!" He dragged Ellen toward it. I came through the service hatch onto the gallery floor and took a blind swing across the mouth from a man who never saw me. My teeth clicked together. Blood filled my mouth. I kept moving. A girl, maybe 10 years old, clamped onto my leg and begged me not to let the ground swallow her. I had to peel her off and pass her to a med orderly, forcing his way in through the side corridor. Then the siren started. Mass psychological event. The official term for an arrival sickness outbreak severe enough to trigger security deployment. Lockdown doors rolled across cross corridors. Civil order teams flooded in wearing face shields and impact padding. Their speed told me more than Galt's trim packet had. They had been positioned nearby before the break began. Nate and I got Ellen into the service corridor just as the main doors sealed. She leaned half her weight on him, half on me, every step jarring the healing mesh in her pelvis. She kept saying the same thing in a thin, breathless voice. She was there. She looked young. She looked the age before the hatch. Mrs. Doran had died 8 years earlier in a pressure loss incident at a school compartment. Nate heard Ellen and looked at me with a fury that had not yet found language. "What did you do?" "I cut the display." "What did you do before that?" Nothing I could say would mean the right thing. Behind us, the gallery boomed with bodies against doors and the sharp bark of security commands. Then Kessler's voice came over the deck again, calm as liturgy. By authority of Central Stewardship, approach has been suspended. Citizens remain in place. Medical teams are en route. Arrival strain has reached critical threshold. This world will be passed in the interest of species continuity. Passed. Just like that. Harkort became another almost home folded into doctrine. Nate stared at me as if I had personally opened the thing in the wall. Ellen bent double with pain and retched dry over the deck. There was nothing in her stomach to bring up. I got an arm under her and helped Nate move her toward Ward 9, while med teams and security squads streamed the other way. Around us, the Ark changed state. Celebration turned to containment like a drill they had run before. That was the detail I could not let go. Practice. By the time Ellen was settled in a treatment bay and I staggered back toward propulsion, 3 more galleries had reported mass episodes. One man had torn open his own face on a broken display frame. 2 children had gone over a balcony in Gallery 7. A memorial priest had knelt smiling in a tram lane because he believed his dead wife was waiting beyond it. Galt met me at the deck hatch and hauled me into the drive room by the front of my jacket. You leave your station during active burn again and I'll finish what the current started. His words landed hard, his grip harder. He let go when he saw the marks on my wrist and the blood drying at my mouth. You saw it? He asked. I saw a hidden module wired into the galleries. We have shipwide panic. We had it ready. His face gave me 1 second of stillness. No more. Reset your board, he said. We have departure geometry. Harkort is viable. Harkort is behind us. Because someone made sure people broke. Galt looked past me at the burn board, where the trim packet had already shifted us toward cruise correction. Stark, he said, quieter now. If you want to survive this ship, learn the line between what you know and what you can carry. He walked away. I reset my board. My hand bled on the keys. Somewhere above me, med teams were strapping screaming people into transport frames under the old doctrine that had once again saved us from ourselves. And the Ark was turning away from the first world I had ever seen close enough to name with my own eyes. I worked another 4 hours before release. Then I went into the dead passages behind navigation and started stealing our history. The archive run crossed a maintenance void with no public use left, a narrow crawl behind the nav core where old data trunks still bundled before rising to command. I had grown up in Ring 5, where boys learned forgotten routes because forgotten routes were the only places free from supervision. Nate and I had spent half our childhood slipping into those spaces to drink contraband tea and listen to the ship work around us. That night, I went alone. My mouth had swollen by then. My right hand still spasmed when I flexed it. I clipped into an older trunk and began pulling approach records under propulsion review authority. The ship denied half my requests and returned the other half stripped or partial. I began comparing what remained. Course change, atmospheric sample, water mass confirmation, surface mapping, public caution order, psychological event, approach terminated, again and again. The candidate worlds no longer carried their public names. Those had been removed long before my birth. But propulsion traces remained, because some engineer generations dead had trusted numbers more than memory. I found 5 clear matches before I ran out of easy access: air, water, gravity bands with intolerance, surface temperatures fit for settlement arcs, worlds close enough to begin landing prep, then abandoned after some variation of the same sequence. Panic event, medical surge, civil disorder, abort. I was still cross-checking timestamps when a voice behind me said, "You're tugging at a restricted archive like a boy robbing a pantry." I turned too fast and cracked my head on the duct above. Dr. Miriam Bellin stood in the hatchway watching me with a gaze that had probably made better men than I feel 12 years old. Bellin belonged to civic medicine, which meant psychiatry, crisis doctrine, and the soft power departments that turned fear into policy. I knew her face from arrival bulletins and educational materials shown to children during preparedness season. Silver hair cut close, spare frame, shoulders beginning to bow with age, eyes sharp enough to look borrowed from a younger, crueler body. "How long have you been there?" I asked. Long enough to watch you choose the least subtle route available. She crouched with care rather than weakness and came into the crawl. Her coat brushed old insulation. She smelled of nothing. Strong personal sense had been bred out of Ark life by air handling and proximity. You signed school guidance on arrival fragility, I said. And you're already less naive than you were an hour ago, which is good. It means I won't have to waste the whole conversation. She looked down at the spread of records on my portable screen. You've found the pattern. That is not the same as understanding the machine that made it. You understand it. I understand enough to know Harkort was no accident. I waited for denial. She gave me none. What are those worlds? I asked. Evidence, she said, not yet proof. You're still missing motive, mechanism, and lineage. Then give me those. No. The answer came flat and immediate. You don't need a sermon, you need a door. Too much truth delivered too cleanly becomes another doctrine, and I have spent too many years watching doctrines do work they do not deserve. She tapped one of the archived root trees. The old approval systems were never fully dismantled. Pieces survived under civic authority, gallery modulation, group response feedback, environmental stress overlays. Harkort used a modern mask over an antique spine. Who's using it? That, she said, is what you go and make undeniable. She held my gaze a moment longer, measuring whether I would keep listening. There is a buried chamber beneath Memorial Ring 6. Publicly, it's an old civic hall. Privately, it was one of the places where consensus stopped meaning what common people thought it meant. Helen Graves can open it, if she believes opening it serves her. I knew the name. Everyone did. Graves held memorial law and burial authority, which on a generational ship amounted to a power close to religion. You're sending me to one of them. I'm sending you where the dead hands are still warm enough to identify. Why me? Because you touched the gallery wiring and survived. Because the younger men in command still think you're a technician with a conscience problem instead of a threat with access. Because if Harkort becomes sacred history before anyone pries the seal off it, the next world will die too. She started for the hatch, then stopped and looked back. When you speak to Helen Graves, remember this. The old crime was never only that terror was used. Terror was taught to masquerade as civilization. Do not mistake a confession for repentance. Then she left me with 5 dead worlds on my screen, and a new sense of how small my life had been until that hour. I should have taken someone besides Nate. That truth came too late to matter. Nate Doran and I had grown up 3 compartments apart, fought the same boys, stolen our first drink from the same plumbing gang, and watched our mothers trade food favors through ration winters. He went into maintenance because he trusted things that could be hit with tools. I went into propulsion because I liked the thought that force could be steered if enough care went into the steering. He loved quicker than I did, hated cleaner, and never confused directness for a flaw. That made him dangerous in a crisis and ideal in a crawl space. Ellen was still under observation when I found him outside Ward 9. He sat in a plastic chair too small for him, elbows on knees, staring at the sealed recovery door, as if he might burn through it by patience alone. "How is she?" I asked. He did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was flattened by exhaustion. "She keeps asking whether Mother looked disappointed." I sat beside him. "That thing in the gallery wasn't her." "I know that." He said it like a man trying to hammer the knowledge into place by repetition. "The med staff says she's physically stable," he went on. "Psych says normal distress response. Civic says avoid visual triggers. Security says nothing because security has already gone home proud of itself. I found old approach traces." That got him to look at me. "What kind of traces?" "Enough to think Harkort wasn't the first." A long moment passed. "I'm going with you," he said. "You don't know where." "I know the ship. I know your face. You've already decided to crawl into something stupid and call it necessity. That usually means you need a second pair of hands." It should have occurred to me then that he would not follow me all the way through the compromise I was about to make. Instead, I felt relief. Systems were easier, with another competent man in the loop. The drop into Civic Vault 3 took us through a memorial service shaft not used since before either of us was born. The public side of Memorial Ring 6 was polished and lit, full of plaques, ancestral rolls, and the solemnity the Graves family sold as continuity. The maintenance gut behind it was bare rib, dead signage, old conduit, and dust so fine it shifted around our boots like disturbed water. "Explain it again," Nate said as he lowered himself down the final ladder. "Bellin thinks there's an old approval chamber down here. Early consensus hall, then something worse. And we're asking one of the families to open it. We're asking Helen Graves to decide whether saving herself matters more than protecting the story. That," he said, "is insane." "No." The chamber door stood 3 meters high and plated in civic bronze gone black at the edges. Old seals showed under newer weld lines. Nate cut the lock with a maintenance lance while I watched the corridor. The metal sagged inward. Inside, the room opened like a theater buried alive. Tiered seats curved around a central floor sunk below deck level. The moderation dais rose at the far end beneath a cracked wall of civic glass. Every seat had armrests wider than necessary. Contact strips ran along the inner edges. Tiny grills dotted the headrests. The floor in the central circle was segmented into plates that could alter angle by fractions too small to see and large enough for the body to feel. Nate crouched beside one chair, thumb over the contact strip. This room shaped people. I went down the aisle slowly, lamp beam passing over old projectors, speaker wells and feedback nodes nested in the ceiling. The room made sense too quickly. A system meant to measure groups breathing, tensing, leaning, interrupting. A system designed not merely to watch response, but to shape it once it knew where the group bent easiest. At the dais, I found an access cradle still alive on reserve power. The file tree opened to a family seal I did not have. Before I could start swearing, a service panel behind the dais released with a soft click. Helen Graves came through wearing mourning grey and carrying a cane more ceremonial than necessary. She was tall for an old woman, narrow in the face, the skin at her temples gone thin enough that every line looked engraved rather than formed. I had seen her once from a distance during a memorial procession and thought of her as carved authority. Up close, she looked like a knife that had spent too long in a drawer and was still sharp out of spite. "You brought a witness," she said, glancing past me to Nate. "I brought a man I trust." "That quality," she said, "has buried more houses than treachery." Nate said, "If you've got something worth saying, say it plain." Her eyes moved over him once, assessing class, trade, accent. "Ring 5, she said. "Maintenance. Good. The men who kept this ship alive should hear why it was kept wandering." She came down the steps with measured care. "My great-grandfather sat in this room during the succession crisis," she said. The Ark had already survived crop failure and lower ring mutiny. Broad ratification was still required for command continuity. Several houses believed shared authority would break the ship into feuding estates. They may even have been right. She let that stay in the air without apology. They turned the chamber from moderator into an instrument. Emotional loading, acoustic stress, floor bias, targeted prompts through trusted speakers. A divided assembly became a frightened one. A frightened assembly became violent. Once blood was on the floor, emergency rule looked like mercy. "Who died?" I asked. "Enough," she said. It was the first lie of omission, and it showed on her like a shadow. "What happened after?" Nate asked. "Security sealed adjacent decks. Opposition collapsed. The houses most responsible for continuity retained it." "Continuity," Nate repeated, disgust plain in the single word. Helen ignored him. "What began here became doctrine elsewhere," she said. "Not immediately. The first men who weaponized this room called it necessity and preferred not to formalize that preference in writing. Later generations improved on their cowardice." "You mean arrival sickness," I said. Her gaze settled on me. "I mean fear wrapped in institutional language." "Then open the records," I can open enough of them to destroy several bloodlines and half the myth of this ship. The question is whether you know the difference between exposure and governance after exposure." Nate gave a hard laugh. "That sounds like a woman bargaining for her grandchildren." Helen turned toward him with more interest than before. "At last," she said, "a man in the room who hears meaning before phrasing." She looked back at me. "There is a confession tribunal already arranged under memorial seal. Dying elders speak there because the ship still grants the old and the dead privileges it no longer grants the living. You will hear testimony. You will leave with names, access paths, and chain of authority. In return, the surviving descendants of Graves, Archer, Delaney, and Kessler blood are not handed to a mob in the first hour. And if I refuse? You leave with a suggestive room and a few damaged scraps, and Adrian Kessler buries Harkort before your next sleep cycle ends." Nate stepped close enough that I could feel the anger coming off him. "You're asking him to spare the seed of the thing that did it." "I am asking him," Helen said, still addressing me, "to distinguish between men who acted, men who inherited, and children who have simply been born in the wrong rooms." "What kind of descendants?" I asked. "Children, adults, one or two who know too much, several who know nothing useful at all. You will dislike some of them. That changes nothing." Nate said my name once, quietly, warning, disbelief, and old friendship packed into it. That should have stopped me. Instead, it drove me deeper into the habit that had governed me since boyhood. Sequence, containment. Preserve the evidence. Prevent the first bad reaction. Build law before vengeance. Solve the system in the order a system demanded. "I'll do it," I said. Nate turned toward me so fast I thought for an instant he might hit me. "You give terms to her?" "I'm taking terms that get us proof. You're taking her shape around your neck and calling it strategy. I'm making sure the truth survives the first hour." Helen watched us like a woman who had seen men discover compromise and mistake it for adulthood. "The tribunal meets tomorrow aboard the St. Rowan," she said. "Come with more caution than righteousness." She handed me a data token. "Family routes, sealed annexes, relay maps. Use them intelligently, which is not quite the same thing as using them well." Nate did not speak again until we were back in the maintenance shaft. "You promised." "I promised the testimony. You promised the blood. I promised not to let Slaughter bury the evidence before we can use it." He climbed the ladder ahead of me, quick and angry. At the upper hatch, he looked down once. "If Ellen dies from what they put in that gallery, and you carry their children through it under guard, I will remember exactly where you chose." Then he left. The St. Rowan was a funeral barge, one of the narrow transfer vessels used to carry sealed dead from Memorial Ring to the outer crypt hull. In ordinary times, clergy and family clerks walked its central aisle among coffin locks and spoke names into registry screens. On that cycle, it floated dim between docking collars, while the latest dead from Harkort waited in covered frames outside for formal passage. Mourners packed the memorial key because people aboard the Ark could sense when a ritual space had become political. Grief never stayed private long on a ship built of shared walls. I boarded through a service collar Helen's token opened. 2 memorial guards in Graves Grey took my name and nothing else. Nate had refused to come. Belen stood at the far end of the aisle with her hands folded over a cane she did not need, and gave me a look that said she knew exactly how alone I had arrived. The tribunal sat between coffins. That was the first thing I noticed when my eyes adjusted. The second was the age of the witnesses. 3 ruling elders in formal grey. A Labour delegate from Ring 2 with oxygen scarring in his throat. 1 retired navigator. A memorial clerk. Belen. Helen. Me. A legal quorum assembled inside death. The third thing I noticed was Stephen Kessler. He stood by the aft lock, young enough to pass for harmless at a careless glance, old enough to know what role he served. Dark suit, family pin at the collar, face trained into composure. I knew him from public ceremonies, one of the younger Kesslers always near Adrian, and never far enough from power to be innocent of it. His eyes met mine with quick, measuring intelligence. Not surprise, recognition. Helen opened the tribunal under memorial seal, invoking the old formula that bound testimony to ancestral law. Her voice filled the barge with the weight of centuries spent teaching the ship what counted as solemn. Then the confessions began. Martin Archer spoke first. He did not tremble. That made him worse. He admitted the chamber sabotage during the succession crisis. Feedback thresholds, moderator prompts, floor bias programs, security prepositioning. He named delegates marked for destabilization, and the decks sealed afterward. "How many dead?" Bellin asked. Archer closed his eyes once. "Officially, 506. Actually?" His mouth worked before the number came. 1,700. A shift passed through the barge. Even among people prepared for horror, the number landed like impact. The retired navigator spoke next of the first past world after the crisis, one with shallow inland seas and easy atmosphere. Not because of unsuitability, because the houses still feared what open ground would do to shared command. Then Sebastian Delaney, breathing through a throat tube and looking half embalmed already, described the first fully engineered arrival event a century later. Delaney's line had controlled clinics and civic health review in those years. "We seeded the decks with warnings," he said. "Parasites in open air, depth sickness, environmental grief response, water compounds to increase vertigo under stress. The galleries did the rest." "You drugged the ship," I said. His eyes slid to me, incurious. "We influenced vulnerability. Fear was already present." He said it the way a bookkeeper might discuss spoilage. Several mothers had thrown children from a stair because they believed the ground below was safe. He said that too. My hands curled against the rail until the cuts in my palm opened again. Helen did not interrupt. Belen recorded every word to a sealed archive line. Outside the hull, voices had begun to gather on the quay. Enough fragments had leaked that mourners understood some sacred story was bleeding. At last, Helen spoke again. "Arrival sickness," she said, "did not begin as medicine. It began as a post-fact explanation for terror, induced where broad consent obstructed concentrated power. Later physicians refined it, educators taught it, ministers sanctified it. By the time my father inherited the secret, the original justification had decayed into habit. Landing would have broken the ruling settlement. That alone became reason enough to fear it. Stephen Kessler spoke without being called. My house did not invent the doctrine." Nobody answered. The line was not defense, it was positioning. "My father's generation inherited the machine already built," he said. "Adrian believes landing under uncontrolled conditions will tear the Ark into retaliatory factions before a settlement charter exists." "Do you believe it?" I asked. He looked at me fully then. "I believe exposure will not make your better angels practical. I believe grief armed with names kills faster than law can be assembled." There was his shape at last. Not innocence. Managed survival in younger skin. Before anyone could answer, the barge jolted. The aft lock alarm shrilled. One guard shouted. A crack rang through the hull, then another. Charge bolt impacts from ship security carbines. Hard slugs driven by coil acceleration. Enough to shatter bone and composite alike. Bellin said one word. "Adrian." The barge lights dropped into emergency red. Outside, the crowd surged against the control barriers. I heard the change in the sound immediately. No longer grief. Purpose. "Take the archive," Helen said to me. The memorial clerk shoved a data case into my hands. Absurdly light for what it held. The aft doors blew inward. Security men in dark impact coats poured through breaching smoke. One memorial guard dropped before he could turn. The other fired once and disappeared under bodies. Everything came apart at once. Labour Delegate Dwyer pulled a sidearm from inside his coat and shot one attacker in the throat. Sebastian Delaney toppled from his chair, his line spraying bright against the coffin rail. Women outside hammered the outer lock and screamed for the families inside to be named and handed out. I saw Stephen move toward Helen. toward the family case at her side. I caught him by the collar and drove him into a coffin lock hard enough to split his brow. He hit back like a man who had trained in private. His elbow slammed my injured wrist. Fire shot up my arm. He tore loose and said close to my ear, almost conversationally, "If Adrian wins this hour, you die with the rest. Then help me stop him." He looked toward the smoke, where 2 more security men were forcing the aisle while the outer crowd battered the hull. I saw the shift in his face before it reached his body. He had expected suppression. Adrian had come for extermination. Stephen snatched up a fallen guard's stun rod and went into the smoke. I found Helen crouched beside Delaney's chair, one hand over her side where red spread through grey cloth. "Can you move?" "Enough. Where are your people?" "Registry annex below memorial intake. Family route is marked green in the token." Her fingers closed on my sleeve with surprising strength. "Take Graves, Archer, Delaney and Kessler blood, all of them." I heard what he said. "So did I," she said. The outer clamp screamed. The crowd was almost through. If mourners entered while security still attacked from the rear, the whole barge would become slaughter. I made the choice there, between coffins, archive case under my arm, old woman bleeding in my hands. I chose the descendants. I got Helen over one shoulder and dropped through a service hatch beneath the registry bench. Bellin saw what I was doing and gave one sharp nod before turning back to the recording line. She stayed with testimony. I left with what could still move. Stephen came through the smoke with blood down one side of his face and the stun rod in his fist. Behind him, the memorial clerk crawled, dragging Archer's grandson, a terrified youth old enough to shave and young enough to be useless. We got 4 people into the shaft before the first mourners burst through the outer lock above us. As I sealed the hatch, I heard one woman scream, "Name them!" The service drop ran under the memorial key into a family annex no one outside burial law knew existed. Helen's line had hidden escape space under the dead for generations. The room at the end held water packs, seal blankets, food, medkits, and 6 frightened descendants from 4 houses. One was a child. One was Stephen's married sister, already far enough along in pregnancy for the shape to show under her coat. One was Archer's grandson, the same boy dragged down from the barge. The rest were adults in their 20s and 30s, pale with the knowledge that old privilege had finally become prey. Nate found us there. I still do not know how. Perhaps he followed me from the quay. Perhaps someone saw the service hatch cycle. Perhaps men raised in maintenance guts simply know where a man like me will run when he has to disappear with a burden. The annex door cut open under his emergency torch. He stood there with 3 maintenance men from Ring 5, all armed with work tools heavy enough to stop hearts. His gaze moved from my face to Stephen's blood, to Helen Graves folded in a chair with seal foam over her wound. Then to the child. Then back to me. "You carried them out." "I carried the archive out too." "You carried them out." One of the maintenance men behind him spat on the floor. Stephen shifted his weight, measuring room. The pregnant woman had begun crying without sound. The little girl from Graves' blood stood with both hands over her ears, staring at Nate as if he were weather. "Harkort happened because of them," Nate said. "Harkort happened because of the people still in command," I said. "These are evidence, leverage, witnesses. Evidence has faces. So does a crowd." His eyes flared at that. He had brought men and tools into a hidden room, and I had named the thing waiting outside without granting it the comfort of a noble word. "You think I came here to cut children?" he said. "I think if this room opens into a corridor right now, nobody controls what happens next." One of his men moved towards Stephen. Stephen drew a slim shock blade from inside his sleeve. The maintenance man saw the motion and swung first with a spanner. Stephen ducked. The spanner hit Archer's grandson full in the temple. The boy dropped without a sound. Everything after that became hands, impact, shouts, bodies colliding with walls. Nate lunged for his own man, maybe to stop him, maybe to strike him down. I never knew which. I caught Stephen's wrist before the blade reached a maintenance throat. Someone slammed me into the storage rack hard enough to rattle my teeth. The archive case hit the floor. I heard something inside crack. When the room became people again instead of motion, Archer's grandson lay dead under the bench, and the maintenance man who had struck him was on his knees vomiting from what he had done. Nate looked at the body, then at me, and something in him changed from rage into certainty. "That blood is yours," he said. He left before I could answer. His men followed, dragging their shaking companion with them. One door cycle later the annex sealed, leaving me with a dead boy, a bleeding matriarch, and the man who had hidden a weapon in formal clothes because he had expected trouble all along. Helen opened her eyes after a long moment. "Now," she said, "you begin to understand. I understand I should have left your line on the barge. You still may. Your people manufactured mobs. My people manufactured order through terror," she said. "The Ark learned the rest on its own. The annex had one med scanner. I used it on her first. The bolt crease had torn muscle along the lower ribs and missed the lung. Bloody, painful, survivable with foam and rest. While I worked, Stephen sat against the far wall with his hands visible and watched me with a calm that did not read as trust. When I finished, he said, "Adrian has already moved to the next stage." "What next stage?" "Final approach control." "There is no final approach. There is now." He told me then what Harkort had bought the regime. One more cycle of fear to justify accelerated passage toward another viable world already sitting ahead on the long scan arc. Adrian intended to tighten doctrine through disaster, then manage one more approach under conditions designed either to preserve the houses through landing or justify another pass with the ship too divided to resist. The gallery net was one piece, Stephen said. Fragments of the approval system still exist in civic architecture. Med alerts can be spoofed, quarantine triggers can be set, public channels can be saturated with contradictions. Once dissent starts, panic doesn't need to be invented. It only needs to be directed. Why tell me? Because Adrian tried to erase the witness pool on the barge. Because if he turns this into a full blood purge, there will be nobody left to bargain with after landfall. Because survival is narrower than loyalty tonight. Not remorse, recalculation. That made more sense. We moved the descendants before the barge slaughter could settle into official language. I took them into a decommissioned agricultural ring tucked under old colony stores. The place had once been a training habitat for first settlers, full of soil vaults, seed cabinets, irrigation racks, hand tools made for a life nobody had been permitted to live. Dust lay thick over planter beds wide enough for dwarf wheat. Crates marked surface shelter sat sealed in rows. The whole ring felt like a future packed up and hidden until it became a mausoleum. I set guards from nobody's house at the outer hatch. Propulsion men, maintenance techs, one dock supervisor with no patience for stewardship myths. Fewer with each passing hour. Belen found us there after the St. Rowan vanished from official bulletins. Glass had cut one side of her scalp. She carried the surviving record line under her coat like a priest carrying relics from a fire. "Archer is dead," she said. Delaney bled out. 2 labor witnesses are in security custody. Helen's testimony survived because I routed it through memorial seal before the barge sealed. Can it go public? It can. The better question is when. I looked across the agricultural ring. Stephen sat on an overturned seed crate speaking quietly with his sister. Helen slept under blankets beside a bank of dead pumps. The little Graves girl with the scraped knees stared at a row of colony shovels, as if she were seeing the outline of a life her own family had denied everyone else. "Now," I said, "before Adrian resets the story." Belen shook her head. Truth landing on a frightened ship does not arrive as reason. It arrives as fuel. He's planning another engineered collapse. Yes, which is why timing matters more, not less. We might have argued longer, but my pad chimed once with a sector stamp I knew before I opened it. Ellen is gone. That was all Nate sent. She had died in a clinic corridor crush when security sealed a ward under a false quarantine alert tied to the barge panic. Her repair had failed under the pressure of bodies against the lock. I sat on a crate of unused surface tarps and read the message 3 times without feeling the words become more real. 30 meters away, the descendants of the ruling houses drank from my water stores and whispered about escape routes. I could have answered Nate. I could have told him I had not known the quarantine would spread that far, that I was 2 steps from forcing a landing, that Ellen's death would mean something if I ended the doctrine before it killed again. Instead, I stared at the dimming screen and understood with extraordinary uselessness that explanation is often just another privilege of the man still alive. Nate came in person before cycle end. He brought 8 men and 1 woman from lower medical, all of them carrying the kind of anger that changes the pressure in a room. The woman still wore dried blood on one sleeve from Ellen's row. He stopped well short of me. That was worse than charging. "Release them," he said. "We need them alive through descent. You need them alive because you promised. We need them alive because dead heirs satisfy the first appetite and poison every tribunal after." The medical woman stepped forward. "Children from Harkort still wake screaming for dead relatives on shore. Men in recovery are cutting their own skin to dig out parasites that never existed. Your steward in waiting is sitting 20 paces behind you under guard." Stephen had risen from his crate. The sight of him standing under my protection almost won the argument by itself. Nate looked past me, saw him, and laughed once without warmth. "There," he said. "That's the shape of you." I moved closer because the distance between us had grown dangerous. "Listen to me. Stephen knows the relay paths. Belen has testimony. I can cut the chamber amplification and dump proof onto every public line when the next approach begins. You still think the right reveal fixes this?" The sentence struck clean because it named my own private faith more exactly than I had. "It gives us a chance. It gives you a way to keep your promise and call it necessary." His people took a half step together at that. Not toward me yet, toward the room. I drew my sidearm. I had been carrying it since the St. Rowan. The motion froze the ring for one hard breath. "I'm getting this ship to ground," I said. "Any man who forces that hatch before descent helps Adrian." The woman from medical spat near my boot. "Any man who guards them helps him already." Nobody fired. Nobody rushed. That would have been easier. A siren cut through the ring from outer deck, then another, then the broken stutter of civic override. Public channels woke all at once with contradictory orders. Quarantine update. Security redeployment. Memorial caution. Approach rehearsal. Countermand. Reissue. Spoofed clinic alerts. The sabotage had started early, or Stephen's timetable had already gone stale. Belen was at the console in 3 strides. "He's flooding channels," she said. "Signal saturation. The next world is closer than he told you." The moment broke into necessity. Nate looked from the channel storm to me, then to the descendants. "You get 1 chance," he said. "If your landing turns into another butcher's right, I open every lock you sealed." He left with his people before I could decide whether the words were mercy or sentence. The final approach began under rain. Static rain. Grey bands pouring down every public screen on the Ark, while system alerts stacked and vanished too fast to pass. 3 hours later, the next candidate world rose into the forward feed, larger than Harkort had been when it died on our walls. Its survey name was Bell. Bell had continents broken by inland seas, a wide, temperate band, river deltas broad enough for first settlement. We should have been singing arrival hymns. We were in information war. Galt was on the infirmary deck with a broken jaw from a security sweep in propulsion. I took the burn cradle under emergency authority. Caleb worked beside me with his right eye wrapped in bandage from shattered gallery glass. He had sent his wife and daughter to a lower shelter 2 hours earlier and come back anyway. "You look terrible," he said as I strapped in. "You look worse." "That helps." The board came alive under my hands. Bell filled the forward scope like a fact too large for the Ark's culture to absorb without splintering. Descent windows opened and closed in my head as habit, angle and mass turning into choice. If we passed Bell after this, I knew with total certainty the ship would never survive itself to see another chance. My first act was betrayal. I pushed the tribunal archive to every public channel cluster I could touch, using the memorial seals Belaine had preserved and the route Stephen gave me into civic distribution. Confession fragments burst through family feeds, labor nets, school archives, prayer rolls, work sector traffic. Names followed. The Chamber, the Purge, the staged outbreaks, Harkort. For 12 seconds, the Ark had the truth. Then, Adrian Kessler answered. His face came across every major screen above the archive stream, one hand braced on a command lectern. "Citizens," he said, "you are experiencing coordinated psychological attack during a rival strain. Fabricated ancestral footage and manipulated confessions are circulating to induce collapse. Obey only validated channels, avoid visual exposure, report dissociation, grief apparitions, and family paranoia at once." He had my move inside his move. By naming the symptoms in advance, he folded revelation back into doctrine. Men and women trained from childhood to fear their own minds saw confessions naming dead ancestors and felt the old floor tilt under them. Some believed the testimony. Some believed Kessler. Most got both at once. The galleries opened anyway. He could have sealed them and blamed me for disorder. He wanted proof of public fracture more than safety. He always had. On my side feed, Gallery 7 filled, then Gallery 2, then the Great Civic Bay in Ring 3 where school groups and elder homes had been brought under escort. Bell entered the screens with a clarity that hurt. Open water under cloud shadow. White weather along a mountain chain. A river mouth broad as a country. Then the sabotage net engaged. This time the image did not merely deepen, it individualized. The system drew on grief data, memorial rolls, clinic histories, even tags from the archive I had just released, and folded them back into the visual field. Men saw sons lost in pressure failures, standing knee-deep in surf. Women saw mothers dead in transport fires waving from hill lines. Children saw dead pets racing along beaches never touched by human feet. Bell became a surface each viewer's worst absence could step onto. People broke. In Gallery 2, a teacher tried to herd children to the exit, while half of them screamed for fathers in the shallows. In Ring 3, an old carpenter walked into the barrier until his nose flattened because his wife of 16 dead years stood beyond it in the grass. 2 clinic attendants fought over a sedative syringe while the patient between them clawed at his own arms to dig imagined parasites out. Somewhere in Memorial Ring 6, a clerk opened burial vaults because the dead, he said, should see the world before landing. Nate and his people moved through the gallery corridors, shutting projection banks down by force. Their progress showed on my side feed as sections of black, static, then darkness. He was doing exactly what I needed, and would still have gladly broken my neck for asking it. Belen took a maintenance tram toward the old chamber to cut the amplification at the source. That had always been the strongest node. The story had taught me to think reveal first. But by then, even I knew exposure alone was not enough. The machine still had a pulse. It had to be stopped physically. The drive room doors banged open. Galt came in with half his face bound white and fury holding him vertical. "What have you done?" "Given the ship evidence." "You gave Kessler more panic to work with." "He already had panic. I'm landing us through it." He looked at the board, saw the descent commit line glowing amber, and understood before anybody else in the room what I meant. "You cross that threshold without central authority," he said. "Every death after belongs to propulsion. Every death before already does." He hit me then, a hard backhand across shoulder and jaw because the cradle straps held me in place. I tasted old blood again. Caleb stepped between us and Galt shoved him into the side rail. The channels rolled over into outbreak status. Fake clinic alerts lit ward sectors. Quarantine doors dropped in the middle decks. Civilians trapped one another in stairwells, believing whole sections had gone contagious under a rival strain. Somewhere forward, Someone set fire to memorial hangings because the names on them were calling out. The approval signal spiked. Bellen's voice came through a maintenance relay tied straight into my ear set, raw with exertion. "I'm in the chamber." Behind her I heard glass breaking, boots on old metal, the deep tone of that buried theatre. "The main amplifier is live. He tied the galleries to it through emergency policy channels. It's feeding on disagreement and fear together. Can you cut it?" "Yes." "Can you get out?" A short sound came back, almost a laugh. "That was never the serious part of the plan." The line filled with shouts, one male voice close, then a charge bolt crack. Belen drew one hard breath through her teeth. "Stark, the families taught this ship to mistake managed terror for civilization. Do not make the same mistake in reverse." "What reverse?" "Believing exposure makes men noble." The line went dead. The approval signal collapsed 20 seconds later. Across the gallery feeds, people were still panicking, but the synchronized edge went out of it. The room stayed dangerous, fractured and loud, but one invisible hand was no longer pushing them in the same direction. Belen had done it. She had also put a knife into the error I had been living inside. I had thought truth, timed correctly, would make decency practical. Instead, it had multiplied fear on a ship raised to receive fear as law. Bell filled half the forward scope. Galt saw the same closing window I did. If we pulled up now, the Ark would survive mechanically and die in every other sense. If we committed, we would throw a generation ship built for controlled systems through atmosphere while half its civic nerves screamed. The security channel opened without request. Adrian Kessler stood on it from command. "Stark," he said, "stand down. Your leak has confirmed acute arrival syndrome at scale. We will pass Bell and restore order." I opened the line to the whole drive room. "You staged Harkort. I preserved the Ark from premature collapse. You killed people for policy. I inherited a vessel held together by ritual, hierarchy and fear. You have cut all three in a day." He leaned closer to the camera. "Look at your feeds. Parents striking children. Clinics in mutiny. Memorial law broken open. This is your truth. If you land now, Bell receives a civil war." He was lying about cause and telling the truth about condition. That was the ugliest form of power he possessed. Galt stopped arguing. He had reached his own answer, and it was not mine. I unstrapped. Caleb said my name. I ignored him. The command access corridor ran behind propulsion through two sealed hatches. Stephen's roots had given me maintenance override codes. Galt caught at my arm at the first hatch and I drove the manual wheel into his forearm. Something cracked. He dropped cursing. I went through. Kessler's forward control platform sat one level up from propulsion, linked by a narrow bridge meant for command oversight during major maneuvers. Bell's light washed through the scope wall behind him. He had two security men and a board full of civic channel trees at his back. One guard raised his carbine. I fired first. The bolt hit him high in the chest and spun him into the rail. The second guard got a shot off that tore skin from my upper arm and smashed into the hatch seal behind me. Then Caleb was there somehow, past Galt in the corridor, tackling the guard sideways into the channel board hard enough to throw sparks. Kessler backed toward the descent console. "You think landing ends this?" he said. "It ends you. It ends the structure that fed every child on this ship. It fed them on stolen years. And what feeds them after? Lower ring revenge? Committee law? Faith in men during mass panic?" He reached for the abort key. I shot him in the throat. He hit the console on the way down, blood spreading dark across the status glass, one hand clawing uselessly at the board. His eyes stayed on mine through the whole fall, furious even then that a propulsion officer from Ring 5 had stepped into the line where families had stood for generations. I dragged him clear and locked descent. Once the commit line goes green on a ship our size, choice turns into procedure and procedure into survival math. I dropped back into the cradle, sealed my harness, and threw Bell's atmosphere into the board. The Ark screamed. There is no cleaner word for atmosphere entry in a vessel built to endure distance rather than land elegantly. The hull took stress across seams designed for vacuum and slow correction. Every deck reported impact failures. People who had never known gravity variation beyond ring differential suddenly felt the ship become heavy in strange directions. Cargo broke loose. A water spine burst in Ring 2. One outer memorial arm sheared halfway off and took 40 coffins into cloud. We rode it. Caleb got back to his board with blood down both sleeves and talked fuel ratio aloud to keep himself conscious. Galt, one arm hanging wrong, strapped in beside me and worked thrust trims without asking permission. Whatever he thought of me, the burn was the burn once it had begun. I used one spare channel for a single act I knew would mark me. I routed shelter priority to the agricultural ring annex and locked the descendants under guard with colony stores and med access. No public location, no list. Survival for the bloodlines I had promised to keep through revelation. Bell's upper clouds hammered the hull. One engine bank coughed hot and recovered. Another lost output and forced Galt to bleed angle through correction jets older than either of us. The Ark yawed, shuddered, and fell again, controlled this time, toward a floodplain survey had marked first settlement viable. We hit ground so hard my teeth cut my tongue and the world went white. When sight returned, the board showed local pressure stable, major frame deformation, 3 fires, 6 outer breaches already sealed by crash foam. 1 landed Ark. 1 landed Ark. No one in the room spoke for a second because language had not caught up to fact. Then Caleb started laughing and crying together in the ugly, helpless way grown men sometimes do when their bodies make the choice for them. Galt bowed his head over the board like a man at prayer. I opened my harness and nearly fell on the first step. Bell's gravity was close to ours and still different enough to make every lifetime habit misjudge weight. My arm had gone half numb. Blood from the bolt crease had dried tacky to my wrist. Outside the forward lock, Bell waited. Real ground. Real weather. A sky without ceiling. It took 20 minutes to force the first ramp because the outer seal had jammed under frame twist. During those 20 minutes, the Ark shifted from one crisis into another. Fire teams fought compartment blazes. Medbays overflowed. Families searched casualty rolls. Rumour outran every verified list. Somewhere below, men were already tearing stewardship plaques from walls. Nate met me at the base of the forward ramp when the lock finally opened. Behind him, Bell spread wide and cold under a huge silver sky. The landing zone was coarse grass and black stone ridges and a river flashing in the near distance. Wind moved through the ramp throat and touched my face with a motion no fan aboard the Ark had ever managed. Half the people behind Nate stood crying without shame because the horizon existed. The other half were looking at me. Nate had changed since I last saw him. Not in body, in finality. Ellen's death and descent had burned uncertainty out of him. "We've got camp sectors going up," he said. "Hydro's checking water. Security split. Some came down with us, some ran." He glanced toward the plane, then back to me. "You did it." I might have smiled in another life. The expression died before it formed. "Where are the descendants?" he asked. There it was. Safe. Under your seal. "Yes." He nodded once. I told the camp what happened. Meaning the bargain, the barge, the annex, the locked shelter during descent. A crowd had begun gathering at the foot of the ramp. Labour hands, clinic survivors, mothers carrying wrapped children, burial clergy with soot on their sleeves, men and women who had lost family at Harkort, in Bell descent, and in older outbreaks that now looked different under truth. "Open the shelter," one man called. Another shouted, "Bring Kessler blood out!" A woman near the front held the memorial token of a dead son and said nothing at all. Her silence carried farther than the shouting. Nate shifted just enough to show me the path down the ramp. "You can stay with the camp if you hand them over," he said. We'll build tribunals, maybe real ones, if enough men grow up fast. You don't believe that? I believe camp tribunals are still better than a private promise made under the dead. Wind moved through the ramp again. People behind him lifted their faces into it, as if every breath needed learning. The sky above Bell looked large enough to trigger panic all by itself, yet immediate tasks had already begun teaching new instincts. Water, warmth, shelter before dark. The work of survival had more moral force in it than revelation had. I gave my word, I said. You gave it to a woman whose house stole worlds. I also have the archive. Then keep the archive. Let camp judge the rest. His face softened then, and that hurt more than anger. Daniel, he said, if you walk away with them, you walk away from us. Us meant Ring 5, the dead passages, our mothers trading favours, the men who had kept one another upright through hull scares and ration winters and shift accidents. It meant whatever new settlement Bell might become out of the wreckage of arrival. It meant the only belonging I had left that was not duty or guilt. Behind me, inside the Ark, Stephen Kessler and the rest waited in a locked annex with my guards and the colony stores. Ahead of me stood the first camp of a landed people, wounded, furious, necessary. I saw then the only ending that fit the shape I had made. If I opened the shelter, the crowd would take blood first and evidence second. Dead heirs would satisfy the first hunger and poison every hearing after. If I kept them sealed while remaining inside the camp, I would become hidden steward of the same rotten exception I had killed Adrian to end. Every future negotiation over justice would warp around the private fact that I alone controlled the bodies at its center. The descendants needed to live under named exile, visible and stripped, preserved for testimony without access to command. Someone had to take them beyond the first settlement line. Someone had to keep them from vanishing, ruling or being torn apart before the law that judged them could exist. That someone had become me on the St. Rowan, whether I liked it or not. I stepped down the ramp. The crowd tightened. Nate's hand drifted toward the sidearm at his hip. Not drawing, ready. I'm moving them beyond the first settlement line, I said. Armed quarantine, recorded names, no office, no vote, no house rights. They live and answer when we are capable of asking in law. A man near the front shouted that law was only delay with better manners. Often enough, he was right. I kept going. The archive goes with me. Copies stay with camp leadership and memorial custody. If I fail, release everything. The woman with the dead son's token looked at Nate, not at me. Nate met her eyes, then looked away. He could have stopped me. He had enough men, enough grief, enough legitimacy in that moment to do it. Instead, he gave me one final judgment in a voice everyone heard. You always believed one more layer of control would save the thing under it. Then he stepped aside. I went back into the Ark and opened the shelter. Stephen stood when he saw my face. His sister rose more slowly with one hand over her belly. Helen Graves sat wrapped in blankets, pale from blood loss and age, looking at me as if she had expected no better and hoped for something else anyway. We're leaving the main camp, I said. You live because truth needs bodies attached to names. You live without rank, without office, without private command. Any move toward old power and I hand you over myself. Stephen opened his mouth, perhaps to negotiate. One look at me closed it. We walked out under guard into Bell's wind. The first steps on real soil felt wrong, then heavy, then irrevocable. Grass bent under my boots. The ground pushed back in a way no deck plate ever had. Behind us, the Ark lay scarred and canted on the plain, vast enough to look immortal and already dying as the world that had made us. Ahead of us rose a black ridge where the exile line would begin. Campfires kindled across the floodplain. The first settlement of a species should have looked triumphant from a distance. Ours looked like wreckage learning weather. I carried the cracked archive case under my arm. The shell had split on the St. Rowan, but the data inside still lived. Around me walked the surviving blood of houses that had stolen worlds. Behind me, growing smaller with every step, stood the people who had once been my own, and might become so again, only after years I would not share. Bell gave us open sky, running water, wind without ducts, and a horizon broad enough to swallow every story the Ark had told about itself. I crossed that ground in the company my choices had earned.